So Quintin Hogg, who was the Conservative Party chairman here in Britain, in 1959, came up with a quote which I think pretty decently summarises conservatism. But it's quite a long quote, so you have to forgive me for reading it, because me small brain, so I can't remember everything, right? Conservatism is not so much a philosophy as an attitude, a constant force performing a timeless function in the development of a free society, and corresponding to a deep and permanent requirement of human nature itself. So within that rather eloquent definition of it, we can see part of the definition that we said before, in terms of it's a belief in retaining what is good about society, but analyzing things slowly, like really being skeptical. I think that's probably the best way of looking at conservatism. Yeah, is basically anytime something is new, anytime someone presents a utopian solution to something, yeah, anytime someone comes with a big idea, the job of a conservative is just to really be skeptical of that and really to be like, I don't think that's going to work. I think inbuilt within all human, within all kind of human nature and all animal nature, etc., right, there is a high premium for being conservative, right? So if you imagine like a caveman, right, going out into the forest, right, and he's picking berries, right? Now he knows that certain berries will poison him and other ones will not. So when he comes across a brand new berry that he's never seen before, his instinct will be to say, that's probably dangerous, that's probably going to kill me, so I'm going to be skeptical towards that. Whereas a more liberally minded person might be like, hey, it's a new berry, like, oh, that might taste really nice, right? Like, let's see how that goes, right? Within human society, we do need a kind of balance between liberalism and conservatism, because if we just have pure conservatism, then we'd never experiment, we'd never try anything new, right? The conservative mind is not a very creative mind. At the same time we have with the liberals, if we have a society that's just too liberal and just trying new things all the time, we end up losing a lot of the knowledge we already have, right? And we end up risking what we have for the pursuit of what is new, just because it's new. So the way to kind of think about a harmonious society would be for the liberal to try that berry, hopefully not die, and then for him to then tell the conservative, hey, this berry not only won't kill you, but it actually tastes good. And the conservative would be like, okay, cool. So it seems to be working. Right, let's introduce that into our diet, right? This new berry is fine. However, if the liberal eats that berry and then dies, well, the conservative would be like, well, I told you so. So that's the way to like think of conservatism. Sometimes people critique conservatism for moving too slow on certain issues, and especially when we think about a society constantly progressing with more and more freedoms, with more and more access to broaden the amount of freedoms that people have and stuff, right? Conservatives can often be seen as being on the wrong side of history, but in reality, each social movement has its extremities and also poses a risk to the status quo. If there was no conservative restraining force on some of these movements might end up, getting out of control. And this will lead on to what we can define as kind of being the original intellectual thinker behind modern day conservatism within English speaking, living in a liberal society, right? And this is where we get onto history of Edmund Burke and the French Revolution. So picture this, it's the time of the French Revolution. So you're talking 1789 to about 1792, right? And this was a time at which continental Europe was up in flames. We saw the ancien regime, so the ancient regime, the old order that there was in France, right? With the autocratic monarch, right? With the power of the church, the power of the nobleman, and the kind of disenfranchisement of the vast majority of the peasant population. With that old system completely overthrown, the French revolutionaries weren't simply content with just expanding the franchise, weren't simply content with just a little bit of change for what was, for all intents and purposes, a very stagnant system which had basically existed as it had for probably about a century, and wasn't really benefiting the ordinary people of France. France was really at a point at which its entire society, its sense of itself was crumbling. The old order was just overthrown, but systematically, every single facet of it, right? From from dealing with the aristocracy to the monarchy to the church, Christianity at the time of this kind of revolutionary kind of like period, especially during the time of like Robespierre, they destroyed many churches. They turned churches into temples of reason, as they called it. They created a new secular religion, which was of reason. They even to the extent of, for this, they brought in the metric system, which I know kind of triggers a lot of Americans. But it was a thing of, they, even to the months that we had. And so instead of it being 12 months, they created 10 months, right? They literally tried to restructure every single thing in society, which they saw as being irrational. Edmundburke, across the channel, safely in England, which during this whole time was safe for, by being an island nation, was safe from Napoleonic invasions, and was safe from the kind of revolutionary fervour that we saw on the continent. He was very sceptical of this. And if we see some of the letters that went between himself and Thomas Paine, who we mentioned before, being an advocate for the French Revolution, up until the point where he himself was arrested and thrown into a French jail for it, but never mind. Edmundburke critiqued the French Revolution by saying, if you completely destroy everything, if you have a building and some bits of it are rotten, some bits of it are falling apart, right? If you destroy every part of that building, including the foundations, you no longer have a building, essentially, right? Not exactly in his words, but that's the kind of visual way to conceptualize. There are many things in the old order which do not make rational sense, but which you ought to try and maintain for the sake of the whole structure being able to maintain itself, right? So if we think, for instance, and this is the point that Stephen Fry has made with regard to constitutional monarchies, right? The purely rational perspective, when we look at monarchies, for instance, is to say that they are, why is one person, able to live in mansions and being people kneeling and curtsying towards them, and then their face being on money, and who is this random person, and why is this person held in such high regard? At the same time, if we look today at some of the most progressive societies, the most egalitarian societies, the societies where the freedom of people are really kind of like guaranteed and stuff, right? They also happen to predominantly be in constitutional monarchies, whether we think of England, whether we think of Sweden, whether we think of Denmark, we think of Holland, we think of Norway, we think of Japan. So we're not obviously talking about absolute monarchs here, right? And not to completely get rid of the entire idea of republic, because obviously most countries in the world are republics, and there's some utility in having a republic. But we can't assume that simply by erasing the old order, by simply erasing that which is irrational, that all of a sudden our society will leap forward into utopia, right? And this is essentially the vibe that Edmund Burke was talking about. So he kind of was saying, if we need to make changes to the old order, we need to think very carefully about what those changes are, how far we pursue them, and what some of the consequences to us doing those things are. So what we can think about in terms of what actually unifies conservatives, beyond this kind of general attitude, what else can kind of unify conservative movement? Because just being slightly hostile to utopian ideas is okay, but it's just kind of, is there anything else? When we think about certain ideas as being liberal or conservative, right, we tend to get a rough idea of what those ideas are. So for instance, if people are socially conservative, then they will tend to be more kind of like family values. They'll tend to be more religiously orientated. They'll tend to be opposed to certain things, right? They'll, they'll be basically opposed to kind of like the liberal consensus that we see in the Western world today. At the same time, there are many conservatives who hold very socially liberal positions, whether it's on immigration or like kind of or sexual relationships or any kind of things like that, right? Different places, different times, what is classed as being socially conservative, right, is very different. So for instance, there are many socially conservative people today who will not have the same views that people would have had in the 1950s or 60s, right? People in the 1950s and 60s, many conservatives there were opposed to things like interracial marriage. They were opposed to things like gay rights at all. They believed that the role of women were to be like housewives and not to go outside the home and stuff, right? And there's still elements of that. There's still people in the society who do hold those views, and they're entitled to believe whatever they want. It is, after all, a free society, whether one agrees with it or not. But most conservative-minded people today do not hold those views, and no doubt somewhere in the future, views which most conservatives will be completely hostile to today, they may, over time, change their views on those issues. Another thing that seems to unite conservatives, generally speaking, is a sort of love of patriotism, right? So a love for one's country. The only real contentions that one sees within the conservative movement that are really fundamental. So there's an element to which people will debate economic issues, right? So you'll have some people who are more kind of economically liberal in the sense of being more like free markets and stuff. And then you have people who are more Keynesian, like more kind of like, people like Margaret Thatcher would have referred to as being wet, right? So if we think about leading conservative thinkers, and politicians throughout the last 200 years, you think about people like Disraeli, think about people like Churchill, Harold Macmillan, Calvin Coolidge, Ronald Reagan, Richard Nixon, like Donald Trump, Boris Johnson, right? So if we look at those leaders, right, we can see that actually there's quite a broad range of political ideas, both on economic terms and on social terms, right, which are very different from one another. So other than a kind of love for patriotism and this kind of general skepticism for utopian ideas, there's not a whole lot that unites them. At the same time, there are very few issues within any kind of conservative party that really divides them. So a lot of times on the political left, people tend to have very contentious arguments about many issues, whereas more conservative-minded parties, such as the Conservatives here and the Republican Party, they tend to be relatively united, right? And part of this unity is why, for instance, the Conservative and Unionist Party, founded in 1834, is the most successful political party. It's the oldest and most successful political party anywhere in a democratic society. Because, for instance, in the last 100 years, 2/3 of that time, roughly, Britain being run by Conservatives. So if you look at all the years when Labour were in government over the last 200 years, and you look at all the times when the Conservative Party has been in government, it's roughly around a thing of roughly about 70 years, thereabouts, where the Conservative Party has been in government, whereas it's only been about 30 for the Labour Party, right? So part of this unity, part of this holding together of people who have slightly different views on certain things here, but are united in this kind of opposition to utopian ideas, that actually does hold quite a lot of political sway. So even though people might not necessarily agree on a lot of things, because they're able to have this general attitude, it allows them to kind of like coalesce in this kind of like coalition when it comes to election time, right? And in recent times, the only major issues that we tend to find within the conservative movement, and one can see these most clearly in the election of Donald Trump and in the Brexit vote in Britain, is the debate about what patriotism ought to be defined as. On the one hand, we have people who are more, don't want to kind of necessarily say the word globalist yet, but like kind of more globalist for lack of a better word, right? And these people who, these people basically believe that that Britain or America are more powerful as members of multinational organizations. They're more powerful when they exert their like kind of like their influence and project their power into foreign countries through military intervention, through foreign aid, etc., right? And these people don't tend to have that big of a view on borders. They tend to be like, well, capital and goods and everything can flow between borders, so why not people? Whereas there's the other side of conservatism, which has a certain more of an attachment, I suppose, to the nation state in the sense of wanting to preserve the social fabric within them. They don't want to intervene in other countries. They want to just focus on their own, right? So this is what we think of when we think of America first, right? And other kind of that kind of mindset, right? And so you're not intervening in other countries. Just leave them alone, and they can kind of sort out themselves. We're focusing on ourselves. And in terms of with immigration, they go, well, hold on. It's not that we don't want immigration at all, but if immigrants come to this country, we want them to have views that are similar to ours, where they'll be able to come in and like integrate within the wider society. Again, with this slow and steady change. If we have mass migration, then many conservatives view this as a kind of erosion of the social fabric, erosion of like what the country has been and stuff, and it becomes too rapid of a change and not enough time for the country to kind of like slowly evolve and adapt into that new change, right? So this is part of what is not the only thing that inspired the Trump or the Brexit vote, but this kind of attitude had a big impact on it. So it wasn't necessarily that people were racist or people were this or people were that. It was a thing of, and it wasn't that they were anti-immigrant. They tended to just say, we're fine with it, we just don't want too many coming at one time. It's almost like if one thinks about it at a party, right? If there's a punch bowl and people put a bit of rum in it, then it tastes good and people have a fun time with it, right? If too much rum is poured into the punch bowl at the same time, first of all, it's going to leave a nasty taste, and second of all, people are going to get way too drunk way too quickly, right? And so the whole vibe of the party is gonna go from a nice kind of socially thing to all of a sudden people are just gonna be all over the place, right? So I think that's a very, very visual way of conceptualizing some of the fear that many conservatives have with regard to these kind of issues, right? Too much of a good thing can still be bad, right? And that's something that we have to always bear in mind. There always has to be a certain balance, and this is why I said earlier how there needs to be a kind of balance between the liberal mindset and the conservative mindset, and we have to really think, with the constant debate between the liberal and the conservative, what is that going to evolve into over time? And what is conservatism likely to be in the future?